Here is the complete story, compiled from the hook through part 10. We decided you take her. My daughter-in-law said, after abandoning my frightened grandchild, I thought I had buried the woman I used to be 30 years ago. But when my daughter-in-law shoved my trembling 7-year-old granddaughter into my arms during a violent thunderstorm, I felt that old, cold steel harden in my spine. She looked at me and saw a frail 54-year-old widow. She did not realize she had just handed a weapon to the only person in this family who actually knows how to use one. My name is Martha Ellington. To the neighbors in the sleepy, rain-slicked town of Briar Falls, I was just the widow in the grey house at the end of the lane. I was 54 years old. I knitted blankets for the church charity drive, and I paid my bills on the second Tuesday of every month. They saw a woman who had been worn down by grief and the quiet erosion of time. They did not know that the quiet was a choice, a heavy lid I had bolted down over a life that would have terrified them. The rain was hammering against the siding like handfuls of gravel when the pounding started. It was not the polite knock of a neighbor borrowing sugar. It was a desperate, violent rhythm that shook the front door in its frame. I was awake before my feet hit the cold, hardwood floor. My heart did not race. My breath did not hitch. Old habits, buried under 3 decades of domesticity, snapped back into place with the precision of a loaded chamber. I moved through the dark hallway without turning on a light, my hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm that had not been there since the early 90s. When I threw the door open, the wind whipped rain into the foyer, soaking the hem of my nightgown. Standing on the porch, illuminated by the yellow glare of the street lamp, was Savannah Greeley. My former daughter-in-law looked like a ghost that had been dragged through a swamp. Her blonde hair was plastered to her skull, and her mascara had run in dark, jagged lines down her pale cheeks. But she was not alone. Clinging to Savannah's leg, shivering so violently I could hear her teeth clicking from 3 feet away, was my granddaughter, Ellie. The girl was 7 years old, but looked much smaller in the oversized raincoat she was drowning in. Savannah did not say hello. She did not apologize for the hour. She simply reached down, peeled Ellie's fingers off her jeans, and shoved the child toward me. We decided you take her, Savannah said. Her voice was flat, stripped of any maternal warmth. I looked at her, really looked at her. Most people would have seen a cruel mother abandoning her child. I saw dilated pupils and the erratic twitch of a muscle in her jaw. I saw terror masquerading as indifference. Why? I asked. My voice was calm, the voice of the woman I used to be, not the grandmother I had become. We just cannot handle it anymore. Savannah snapped, refusing to meet my eyes. She stepped back into the deluge. Keep her. Do not call us. She turned and ran toward her car, the engine already idling aggressively in the driveway. As she moved, the headlights swept across the porch, and for a brief second, the light caught Ellie's arm as she reached out for her mother. The sleeve of her coat slid up, and I saw it. A dark, purple bruise blooming across the soft skin of her forearm. It was not the kind of mark a child gets from falling off a bicycle. It was the shape of a hand. I did not call out. I did not chase Savannah down the driveway. I stood still as the taillights faded into the storm, my mind cataloguing the license plate, the mud on the bumper, and the erratic way she took the corner. Come inside. Ellie? I said softly. I ushered her into the warmth of the hallway and locked the door. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home felt final. I knelt to unzip her wet coat. She was rigid, her eyes wide and darting around the room as if she expected the walls to close in. As I pulled the sodden fabric from her shoulders, my hand brushed against something hard and rectangular sewn into the lining of her inner pocket. It was not a toy. It felt deliberate. It felt like evidence. I looked at the bruise on her arm, then at the hidden lump in her jacket, and finally into the terrified eyes of my granddaughter. Savannah had not just dropped off a child. She had dropped off a package. The only question that mattered now was why she had chosen tonight to run, and who exactly she was running from. I took the coat into the kitchen and laid it on the table under the stark light of the overhead fixture. The fabric was heavy with rainwater, dripping onto the linoleum. I reached inside the torn lining of the pocket where I had felt the object earlier. My fingers brushed against something cold and plastic. It was a USB drive, small and black. But what made my stomach turn was the way it had been secured. It was taped to the inside of the fabric with a beige adhesive bandage. It was a desperate, improvised hiding spot, the kind a panicked mother thinks of when she has 10 seconds to act. I peeled the bandage away. The drive felt heavy in my palm. Ellie was sitting on one of the dining chairs, her legs dangling, unable to touch the floor. She was clutching a mug of warm milk I had heated for her, but she was not drinking. She was watching my hands. They told me not to tell anyone. She whispered. Her voice was so quiet, I almost missed it over the sound of the rain lashing against the window pane. I stopped examining the drive and looked at her. Who told you that? Ellie. She looked down at the milk, her small shoulders hunching up. Them. The men. They said if I told anyone about the little stick, Mom would disappear. The word disappear hung in the air between us. It was a specific word. Not hurt. Not leave. Disappear. That was the language of professionals. My thoughts immediately went to my son, Grant. He had been a police officer once, a long time ago. He had worn the badge for 3 years before his gambling debts became heavier than his sense of duty. He had resigned before he could be fired, and since then, he had drifted into the grey areas of the law, working security for people who paid in cash and did not ask for receipts. I had always feared his carelessness would catch up to him. Tonight, it seemed it finally had. I left Ellie in the kitchen and went to the small study at the back of the house. I booted up my laptop. It was an old machine, but I kept it clean. I inserted the drive. A window popped up, displaying a chaotic list of folders. Most were empty, but one was labelled North Pine Development Group. I opened it. It was not photos or videos. It was spreadsheets. Rows and columns of financial transactions, routing numbers, and offshore accounts. It looked like a ledger for a construction project, but the numbers were too high, and the dates were too erratic. I scanned the list of board members and investors, my eyes moving quickly down the screen. Then I saw it. Row 42. Harvey Brickster. The name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I sat back in my chair, my breath trapped in my throat. I had not seen that name in 20 years. I had not spoken it in 30. Harvey Brickster was not just a businessman. He was a ghost from a life I had erased. Seeing his name on a drive hidden in my granddaughter's coat was not a coincidence. It was a declaration of war. I stood up and walked back to the kitchen. Ellie? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Did Mom say anything else? Did you see anyone following you? She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes again. A black car. It was behind us for a long time. Mum was crying. She said she had to get me to you, because you would know what to do. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Grant's number. It went straight to voicemail. That was the most terrifying detail of the night. Grant lived on his phone. He survived by being available to every lowlife who needed a favor. For his phone to be off meant he was either in custody, on the run, or somewhere much worse where phones were not allowed. I ended the call and looked out the kitchen window into the dark, wet yard. The trees were thrashing in the wind. I knew I would not sleep tonight. I could feel the adrenaline starting to pump through my veins. A familiar, toxic fuel. Harvey Brickster was back. He was involved with my son. And now, his shadow was falling over my house. I touched the cold glass of the window. If he thought he was dealing with a helpless grandmother, he was about to make a fatal error. Most people in this town assumed my husband left me a comfortable nest egg when he passed. The truth was far more complicated. The checks that sustained my quiet life did not come from an insurance company. They came from a blind trust managed by the Federal Urban Crime Bureau. For 15 years, I was not Martha the Knitter. I was Agent Ellington, a senior investigator with a badge and a clearance level that would have made our local sheriff choke on his morning coffee. I had spent the better part of the 90s hunting down white-collar criminals who thought a suit and tie made them untouchable. My magnum opus was a case in Chicago back in 1998. I spent 18 months buried in the financial entrails of a syndicate run by Harvey Brickster. On the surface, Harvey was a philanthropist and a real estate mogul. Underneath, he was washing millions of dollars of cartel money through a chain of luxury hotels. I was the one who found the ghost accounts. I was the one who signed the affidavit that authorized the raid on his penthouse. I never forgot the day of his sentencing. He did not scream or fight the marshals. As they led him away, he stopped and looked directly at me. The courtroom was loud, but the silence between us was absolute. He mouthed 3 words that had haunted my nightmares for the first few years of my retirement. I will wait. I scrubbed my life clean after that. I left the bureau, moved to Briar Falls, and buried Agent Ellington deep underground. I became a ghost to keep my family safe. Grant grew up thinking his mother was a boring bookkeeper who checked tax returns for small businesses. I never told him that the reason I was so strict about his curfew was not because I feared him getting into trouble, but because I feared who might be waiting for him in the dark. I hid the truth to protect them. But looking at the USB drive in my hand, I realized that my silence might have been the very thing that endangered them. North Pine Development Group was clearly Brickster's new front. It had all his signatures, the complex layering of shell companies, the inflated construction costs, the vague consulting fees paid to entities that did not exist. He was back in the game, and he was likely moving hundreds of millions of dollars right under the nose of the federal government. This drive was the smoking gun. It contained the unencrypted ledger, the kind of evidence that puts people in prison for the rest of their natural lives. My heart sank as I thought of Grant. My son was not a mastermind. He was a follower, a man who always looked for the easy way up and found the quick way down. Brickster must have recruited him, or perhaps Grant had unknowingly taken a security job for the wrong people. If Grant had stolen this drive, he had done something incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. He had stolen the keys to the kingdom from a man who killed for sport. I looked at the landline phone on my desk. The instinct to call for help was strong, but I crushed it immediately. I could not call the Briar Falls Police Department. Harvey Brickster did not operate without insurance. In Chicago, he had judges and captains on his payroll. In a town this small, Buying a deputy or a sheriff would cost him less than a dinner at one of his hotels. If I reported this, the only thing that would arrive at my door would be a cleaner sent to retrieve the drive and silence the witnesses. I was on my own. I closed the laptop and felt a cold resolve settle over me. I had spent 20 years pretending to be a harmless old woman. It was time to remind Harvey Brickster why he used to be afraid of me. I went to the utility closet, where the hard drive for my home security system hummed in the darkness. I rewound the footage to 12:15 in the morning, on the grainy black and white monitor. I watched Savannah's car screech into my driveway. But it was what appeared 10 seconds later that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A black sedan rolled slowly past the house, its headlights killed. It lingered for a moment, just a dark silhouette against the rain, before accelerating away. I paused the frame and zoomed in. The license plate was muddy, but I recognized the partial sequence. It was a rental from the airport, the preferred vehicle for cleaners who wanted to remain untraceable. We could not stay here. I woke Ellie gently. I told her we were going on an adventure. I packed a go bag in 3 minutes flat cash, 2 burner phones I had kept in a safe under the floorboards, and my Smith & Wesson. I hustled Ellie out the back door and into my old station wagon, keeping the lights off until we were a mile down the road. I drove to the outskirts of town, to a small, overgrown bungalow where Janet Morales lived. Janet had been the best forensic analyst the Bureau had ever seen until a political scandal pushed her into early retirement. She was the only person on earth I trusted with my life. When she opened the door, she did not ask why I was there at 2 a.m. with a traumatized child. She saw the look in my eyes and stepped aside. 10 minutes later, Ellie was asleep on Janet's sofa, covered in a quilt, while Janet and I sat in her basement, surrounded by the hum of servers. I handed her the USB drive. "This is nasty stuff." "Martha," Janet muttered, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "It is military-grade encryption. Whoever locked this did not want it opened by anyone without a federal warrant." It took her 40 minutes to bypass the firewall. When the files finally cascaded onto the screen, the room went silent. It was not just numbers. It was a dossier. From the sofa behind us, a small voice spoke up. I turned to see Ellie sitting up, rubbing her eyes. "Is that Uncle Harvey?" she asked, pointing at a photo of Brickster that had popped up on the screen. "You know him?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "He came to the house," she whispered. "He yelled a lot. Mom cried every time he called. She told him she would not do it anymore. But he said bad things." Janet clicked on an audio file embedded in the folder. The speakers crackled, and then a voice filled the room smooth, arrogant, and terrifyingly familiar. "You do not get to quit, Savannah. You keep the kid close. As long as you have her. I know Grant will do exactly what he is told. Lose the girl, and you lose the husband." The recording clicked off. The silence in the basement was heavy. I felt a wave of nausea, followed by a cold, sharp clarity. Savannah had not abandoned Ellie because she did not love her. She had abandoned her to remove the leverage. As long as Ellie was with Savannah, Brickster could use the child to force Grant's hand. By giving Ellie to me, Savannah was trying to break the chain. Janet pulled up another file. "Look at this. Martha." It was a list of accounts under Grant's name. But they were not savings accounts. They were debts. Massive, crushing debts that had been bought and sold by shell companies owned by North Pine. And next to the debts were transfers, small, irregular payments made to Grant for services rendered. My son was not a partner in this crime. He was a slave. Brixter had bought his debts, owned his financial life, and was using Ellie as the final lock on the cage. Grant was not just in trouble. He was being puppeteered by a monster. And right now, that monster was tearing the city apart looking for the strings he had just lost. I stood in the blue glow of the monitor, feeling a fissure open up in my chest that threatened to swallow me whole. It was the oldest dilemma in the world, the kind they teach you to ignore in the academy, but which tears you apart in real life. Do you save the drowning man who jumped into the water? Or do you protect the child, standing on the dry bank Grant was my son? I carried him. I birthed him. And I loved him with a ferocity that terrified me. But looking at his name on that list of compromised assets, I realized he was also a stranger. I closed my eyes, and the memory washed over me, unbidden and sharp as broken glass. It was the day I handed in my badge, 20 years ago. Grant stood in my kitchen, 24 years old and full of righteous, ignorant anger. He told me he did not know who I was anymore. He said my secrets had poisoned the air in our house. He walked out that door, and for the next 2 decades, I became nothing more to him than a birthday card he occasionally acknowledged. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. He had despised my life in the shadows, yet here he was, drowning in the very darkness I had spent my career fighting. He had not just fallen, he had been ensnared. A small, cold hand tugged at the hem of my sweater, snapping me back to the damp basement. I looked down. Ellie was pressing her face against my hip, her grip so tight her knuckles were white. She did not say a word, but the vibration of her fear travelled straight into my bones. She was terrified that I was going to pass her off to someone else, just like her mother had. She was waiting for the next rejection. I reached down and smoothed her hair, feeling the erratic rhythm of her pulse against my palm. In that moment, the hesitation evaporated. I was not just a grandmother. I was the wall between this child and the wolves. If I fell, there was no one left. Grant was compromised. Savannah was missing. I was the last line of defense. I told Janet to keep decoding the files and stepped into the cool night air of the backyard. The rain had slowed to a drizzle. I pulled the second burner phone from my bag and dialed a number I had not used in 8 years. It rang 4 times. Then, a gravelly voice answered. "Make it quick," a man said. It was Edgar Pine. He was a retired investigator who spent his days fishing in Maine, but he still had his ear pressed firmly to the ground. He was the only man I knew who hated Harvey Brixter as much as I did. "It is Martha," I said. "I need eyes on the street." There was a pause, heavy with the weight of history. Then Edgar spoke, his voice dropping an octave. "Martha, you need to go dark. Immediately. The word on the wire is that Brixter has unleashed the hounds. He is not just looking for a drive. He has a team sweeping the city for Savannah. They have a green light to do whatever is necessary to make her talk. They know she does not have the drive. Martha, they think she knows who does." The phone felt heavy in my hand. Suddenly, the image of Savannah on my porch, wet and frantic, took on a new, horrifying clarity. She had not been cold. She had been calculating. She knew she was a walking target. By leaving Ellie with me, she was not abandoning her daughter. She was drawing the fire away from her. She had turned herself into a decoy to buy her child a chance at survival. All my judgment, all my anger at her for leaving, crumbled into dust. She was doing the only thing a mother could do when the devil was at the door. "Thanks, Edgar," I said, and crushed the phone under my heel. I walked back inside. Janet looked up, fear etched on her face. I picked up my car keys. I was not going to wait for the police. I was not going to wait for the sunrise. Savannah was out there alone, serving herself up on a platter to a monster to save my granddaughter. I looked at Ellie one last time. I would keep her safe. But to do that, I had to go back into the storm. I was going to find Savannah before Harvey Brickster did. And God help anyone who stood in my way. Janet tracked the GPS signal from Savannah's phone to a desolate stretch of land known as the Iron Yards. It was a graveyard for shipping containers and rusted machinery that the city had forgotten 20 years ago. I drove the station wagon with my headlights off, navigating by the grey light of the moon that was struggling to break through the storm clouds. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with the metallic taste of wet rust and ozone. Janet sat in the passenger seat, clutching her tablet like a shield. "Turn left here," she said, her voice tight. "The signal is stationary. It is coming from that cluster of containers near the old weighing station." I parked the car behind a stack of rotting pallets, and we moved on foot. My hand was on my weapon inside my coat pocket. We found Savannah's sedan, abandoned in a patch of tall weeds. The driver's side door was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. The dome light had burned out, leaving the interior in shadow. I approached with my gun drawn, sweeping the area, but there was no one. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the highway. I leaned into the car. The struggle had been violent. The rearview mirror was smashed, hanging by a wire. The upholstery was slashed. On the dashboard, stuck to the plastic with a smear of something dark and sticky, was a torn piece of receipt paper. I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket and shined it on the note. The substance holding it in place was blood. The message was scrawled in shaky, desperate handwriting. "Do not let them take the girl." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. Savannah had fought. She had fought hard enough to bleed, and her last thought before they took her had been for Ellie. She knew I would come. She knew I would find this. Suddenly, the burner phone in my pocket vibrated, the buzzing sound incredibly loud in the stillness. I pulled it out. The screen displayed an unknown number. I looked at Janet, then brought the phone to my ear. I did not speak. I just listened. "Mom." The voice was cracked, terrified, and breathless. It was Grant. "Grant," I said, my voice deadly calm. "Where are you? Do not give it to anyone." He screamed, the sound distorting the speaker. "Mom, listen to me. Do not give them the drive. If you give it to them, they will kill us all. You have to run. Take Ellie." And there was a dull thud on the other end, the sickening sound of flesh hitting concrete, followed by a sharp cry of pain. "Grant," I shouted. Then came the screaming. It was the raw, guttural sound of a man being hurt, not for information, but for punishment. Then the line went dead. I lowered the phone, my hand shaking for the first time in 30 years. Janet was staring at me, her eyes wide with panic. "They have him," she whispered. "They have both of them." I closed my eyes, forcing the mother in me to step aside so the agent could work. I replayed the call in my head, filtering out my son's screams, filtering out my own fear. I focused on the background noise. Behind Grant's voice, there had been a sound, a rhythmic, low-frequency thrumming, followed by a high-pitched mechanical whine that cycled every 10 seconds. I knew that sound. It was not a train. It was not a ship. It was the ventilation cycling system of a heavy-duty industrial freezer. But there was something else, a faint, echoing rattle that sounded like chains hitting a metal fence. I opened my eyes and looked toward the north, where the skyline was dominated by the dark, hulking silhouette of the old meatpacking district. I know where they are, I said. Janet looked at me, confused. The call lasted less than 20 seconds. The background noise, I explained, walking back to the car with a pace that frightened even me. It is the cooling fans at the old North Pine distribution center. They have a specific cycle, and the rattle that is the loose security gate on the west perimeter. I used to patrol that area in the 90s. Brixter had made a mistake. He thought capturing my son and daughter-in-law would force me to surrender the USB drive. He thought he was holding all the cards. He did not realize that by letting Grant make that call, he had just given me the coordinates to his throat. He was not just holding hostages. He was holding my family in a building I knew better than the back of my hand. Get in the car. Janet, I said, starting the engine. We are going to finish this. Harvey Brixter had always suffered from the fatal flaw of the powerful, which was the belief that everyone else was merely a pawn in his game. He thought I was just a grandmother trembling in a housecoat. He had forgotten that pawns, when they reach the end of the board, become queens. I sat in Janet's basement, staring at the glowing screen of the laptop, formulating a plan that relied entirely on his arrogance. We have enough here to bring down the entire Eastern Seaboard operation, Janet said, her hand hovering over the phone. Martha, we have to call the Bureau. The Federal Urban Crime Bureau can have a tactical team here in 2 hours. We cannot do this alone. I reached out and placed my hand over hers, stopping her from dialing. 2 hours is too long, I said coldly. And you know as well as I do that the Bureau leaks like a sieve. If we call them, someone on Brixter's payroll will tip him off before the team even loads their gear. If that happens, Savannah and Grant are dead. He will scrub the site and dump the bodies in the marsh. No, we do this my way. Janet looked at me, terrified but resigned. She took her hand off the phone. My first priority was Ellie. I could not walk into the fire carrying the one thing I needed to protect. I texted Edgar Pine. 10 minutes later, a battered pickup truck rolled into the alley behind Janet's house with its lights off. Edgar did not get out. He just leaned over and popped the passenger door. I knelt down in front of Ellie. She was clutching the hem of my jacket, her face streaked with tears. She knew. Children always know when the adults are saying goodbye. I want to stay with you. She sobbed, burying her face in my chest. Please, Grandma, do not make me go. I took her small face in my hands and forced her to look at me. Listen to me. Eleanor, I am going to get your mother and father. I am going to bring them back. But I need you to be brave for me right now. Mr. Pine is a good man. He is going to take you to a cabin where no one can find you. You are going to be safe there. I promise. She whispered. I promise. I said. I kissed her forehead, a lingering touch that I hoped would not be my last. And then I lifted her into the truck. I watched Edgar nod once a silent vow between old soldiers before he backed the truck out and disappeared into the night. Now I was free. And now I was dangerous. I went back to the computer. I did not need guns for this part. I needed leverage. I opened an anonymous email client and attached a single file from the USB drive. It was a screenshot of the spreadsheet showing Brixter's personal kickbacks from the Chicago Union deal in '98. It was the one loose thread that could unravel his personal fortune, not just his business. I typed the subject line, "I have the drive." The body of the message was short. "You have my son and daughter-in-law. I have the unencrypted North Pine ledger. If you want to stay out of federal prison, we make a trade. Tonight." I hit send. The wait was agonizing. The silence in the basement felt heavy, suffocating. Janet paced back and forth, checking her watch every 30 seconds. "He is not going to answer," she said. "He is going to trace the IP. He thinks he is untraceable." I replied, not taking my eyes off the screen. "He will answer because he wants to know who has the audacity to threaten him." 2 minutes later, a notification chimed. It was a reply. There was no text in the body of the email. Just a set of GPS coordinates and a time 03:00 a.m. I pulled up the map. The coordinates pointed exactly where I knew they would. The North Pine Distribution Center. The meatpacking plant. "He knows it is a trap," Janet said, reading over my shoulder. "He is luring you in. He has no intention of trading. He is going to kill you and take the drive." "I know," I said, standing up and checking the magazine of my pistol. "He thinks I am walking into his kill box. He thinks I am bringing him the drive because I am desperate." I put on my raincoat and turned to Janet. "Delete the local copies," I ordered. "If I am not back in 2 hours. Release the cloud backup to the New York Times and the FBI." I walked out into the rain. Brixter had sent me an invitation to my own execution. He did not realize that I was not the guest. I was the event. I was going to walk into that warehouse not to negotiate, but to burn it down around his ears. The warehouse smelled of stale grease and old blood, a scent that instantly transported me back to the interrogation rooms of the late '90s. I stepped into the vast, cavernous space of the main distribution bay. The only light came from a few industrial halogen lamps hanging high above, casting long, skeletal shadows against the corrugated metal walls. I walked down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing on the concrete floor, making no attempt to hide my approach. I wanted them to see me. In the center of the room, illuminated by a harsh pool of light, was a solitary chair. Savannah was tied to it. Her head was bowed, her blonde hair matted with sweat and dirt, covering her face. "Savannah," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. She jerked her head up. Her left eye was swollen shut, and her lip was split. When she saw me, a look of pure anguish crossed her face. "Martha, you should not have come," she rasped, straining against the zip ties that bound her wrists to the chair. "You have to leave. They are waiting for you." I knelt beside her, my hands moving to check the knots, but she shook her head violently. "Listen to me," she hissed. "Grant did not betray you. He did not sell you out. He was trying to protect Ellie from Harvey. That is why he took the job. Harvey told him if he did not work the security detail, he would come for Ellie. Grant has been swallowing his pride and doing their dirty work for 2 years just to keep them away from her." The confession hit me harder than a bullet. I had spent the last few hours despising my son, thinking he was a greedy fool who had traded his family for a payout. I had been wrong. He was not a traitor. He was a father who was in over his head. Before I could respond, the screech of a heavy metal door sliding open echoed through the warehouse. 2 men walked out from the shadows. They were big, professional muscle, wearing dark suits that looked out of place in the grime of the factory. Between them, they dragged a man whose legs could barely support his weight. It was Grant. They threw him to the floor at my feet. He groaned, curling into a ball. His face was a mask of bruises, and his shirt was torn. I reached for him, my hand hovering over his shoulder. "Mom," he whispered, coughing as he tried to push himself up. "I am so sorry. I tried to keep them away from you. I tried to handle it. He said he would kill everyone. He said he would burn the house down with you inside." I touched his cheek, wiping away a smear of oil and blood. "You did what you had to do, Grant. But I am here now." Slow clapping echoed from the darkness beyond the light. I stood up slowly, turning to face the sound. A figure stepped into the light, immaculate in a charcoal suit, a silk handkerchief tucked into his pocket. He looked older than the last time I saw him in court, his hair now silver instead of black, but the predatory gleam in his eyes was exactly the same. Harvey Brickster smiled, an expression that did not reach his eyes. "I always knew you would come back. Martha," he said, his voice smooth and cultured. "You never could leave a puzzle unsolved, and you certainly never could resist playing the hero." He stopped 10 feet away from me, flanked by 2 more guards who had emerged from the gloom, their weapons drawn and leveled at my chest. "You look well." "Harvey," I said, my voice dripping with 20 years of suppressed rage. "Prison seems to have taught you nothing about humility." "Prison was a sabbatical," he replied with a dismissive wave of his hand. "A minor inconvenience. But this drive you have, Martha, this is a problem. My partners in the East are very nervous about the contents of that little piece of plastic. They prefer their business to remain private." He held out a manicured hand. "Give it to me. Then you and your family can walk out of here. I have no interest in killing you. Martha, you are a relic. You are not worth the cleanup. Just give me the drive, and I will let you go back to your knitting." I reached into my pocket. The guards tensed, fingers tightening on their triggers. I moved slowly, deliberately. I pulled out the black USB drive. "Is this what you want?" I asked, holding it up so the light caught the plastic casing. Brickster's eyes locked onto it. "The ledger," he said softly. "The evidence. Hand it over." I looked at the drive, then at Grant, bleeding on the floor, and finally at Brickster. He thought he had won. He thought I was a desperate grandmother making a plea bargain. He did not know that before I left Janet's house. We had wiped the original files from this specific drive. We had replaced the financial data with a localized executable program, a digital tripwire designed to do one thing the moment it was plugged into a server. I took a step forward. "You want it." "Harvey," I said, feigning defeat in my posture. "Take it. It is over. I just want my family." I tossed the drive through the air. Brickster caught it with a reflex that surprised me. He closed his fist around it and smiled, a look of triumphant satisfaction spreading across his face. "Smart choice." "Martha," he said, slipping the drive into his pocket. He had the bait. Now all I had to do was wait for the trap to snap shut. Brickster handed the drive to his lieutenant, who immediately plugged it into a ruggedized tablet. I stood perfectly still, counting the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. I watched the reflection on the lieutenant's glasses change from a blue waiting circle to a flashing red alert. The upload had begun. "Sir," the lieutenant stammered, his face draining of all colour. This is not the ledger. It is a subroutine. It is uploading everything to the bureau servers in Washington. It just pinged our location to every tactical team within 50 miles. Brixter froze. The arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by the snarl of a cornered animal. He looked at me with pure, distilled hatred. He realized that his insurance policy had just become his death warrant. Kill her. He spat, pointing a trembling finger at me. Kill them all right now. The guard closest to me raised his weapon. He was fast, but he had made a critical error. He had ignored the woman tied to the chair. Savannah let out a scream that sounded more like a war cry than a plea. She threw her entire body weight to the side, crashing the heavy wooden chair violently into the guard's knees. The sound of bones snapping echoed through the warehouse, and his shot went wide, chipping the concrete floor inches from my foot. The chaos erupted instantly. The second guard leveled his gun at my chest. I reached for my weapon, but I was 54 years old, and he was already squeezing the trigger. I braced myself for the impact, accepting that this was how it would end. It never came. Grant launched himself from the floor. He did not have a weapon. He did not have a plan. He just had his body and a desperate need to make things right. He threw himself in front of me just as the gun went off. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Grant jerked violently in midair, taking the bullet meant for my heart, and hit the ground with a wet, sickening thud. Grant, I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat. But the grandmother in me had to wait. Agent Ellington took over. I pulled the Smith & Wesson from my waistband with a fluid motion I had not used in decades. I did not hesitate. I put 2 rounds into the center mass of the man who had shot my son. He dropped without a sound. The lieutenant fumbled for his weapon, panic making him clumsy. I stepped over the fallen guard and pistol-whipped the lieutenant across the temple. He crumbled, sliding down the metal racking. Brixter turned to run, scrambling toward the rear exit like a rat fleeing a sinking ship. He raised his pistol, firing blindly over his shoulder. A bullet grazed my arm, stinging like a hornet, but I did not stop. I raised my weapon to take the shot, to end this vendetta once and for all. Suddenly, the skylights above us shattered, raining glass down onto the concrete. Ropes dropped from the ceiling. The heavy steel doors at the north end of the warehouse blew inward with a concussion that shook the floor. Federal agents, drop your weapons. The voice was amplified, booming from every direction. Men in tactical gear swarmed the floor. Brixter did not stop. He reached the back door and kicked it open, only to find himself staring down the barrels of 6 assault rifles. He froze. For a second, I thought he would raise his gun, forcing them to kill him. It would have been the easy way out. But Harvey Brixter was a coward at heart. He dropped the gun. I walked over to him as the agent slammed his face into the concrete and cuffed his hands behind his back. He looked up at me, dirt on his cheek, blood on his lip. The fear in his eyes was real this time. It was the look of a man who knew he would die in a cage. "I told you," I said, my voice trembling with adrenaline and grief. "I told you I would wait." I turned away from him. The 30-year curse was finally broken. But as I looked back at the center of the room, where Savannah was weeping over Grant's motionless body, I knew the cost of breaking it might have been too high. The paramedics said the bullet missed Grant's major artery by less than an inch. I stood in the sterile hallway of the county hospital, watching through the observation window as the nurses adjusted his IV drip. He was alive, He was handcuffed to the bed rail, and there was a federal marshal drinking coffee at the door. But my son was alive. For the first time in years, the look of terrified desperation was gone from his face, replaced by a calm, albeit painful, resignation. Down the hall, Savannah was being treated for a fractured rib and severe bruising. When I walked into her room, she tried to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at her injuries. Her face was swollen, but her eyes were clear. She did not try to make excuses. She did not try to play the victim. She simply wept, burying her face in her hands. "I am so sorry, Martha." She sobbed, her voice muffled. I did not know what else to do. I knew I was weak. I knew I would break if they tortured me. But I knew you. I knew you were made of iron. I knew you were the only person on this earth who could scare a man like Harvey Brickster. I sat beside her bed and handed her a tissue. "You were not weak." "Savannah," I said softly, "you gave up your freedom to save your daughter. That is not weakness. That is the hardest thing a mother can do." Ellie was waiting in the lobby with Edgar. When I came down, she did not run to her mother's room. She ran to me. She buried her face in my coat, her small arms wrapping around my waist with a strength that surprised me. She was trembling, not from cold, but from the aftershocks of adrenaline. She wanted to see her mother, but she did not want to let go of me. I realized then that the dynamic of our family had shifted permanently. I was no longer just the grandmother who knitted on the weekends. I was the protector. The following morning, the situation with the authorities was formalized. A caseworker from Child Protective Services sat in my living room, reviewing the file. Given the circumstances, Savannah's hospitalization and Grant's pending federal charges, there was really only one option. "We are recommending temporary guardianship be granted to you, Mrs. Ellington," the worker said, pushing a stack of papers across the coffee table. "At least until the parents' legal situations are resolved. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" I looked at the papers. I was 54 years old. I was supposed to be planning garden parties and reading mystery novels, not raising a 7-year-old while her parents navigated the federal justice system. But then I looked through the kitchen door to where Ellie was eating cereal, safe and unhurt. "I am prepared," I said, signing the bottom line. Grant formally surrendered to the FBI that afternoon. He gave a full confession, detailing every debt, every threat, and every illegal job he had been forced to do for North Pine. He was looking at 3 to 5 years in prison, perhaps less with cooperation. It was a heavy price. But when I visited him before the transfer, he smiled. It was a real smile. He told me that for the first time in 2 years, he did not have to look over his shoulder. He was going to prison, but he was finally free. That night, the house was quiet. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the air crisp and clean. I sat in the armchair in Ellie's room, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest as she slept. The nightmare was over. Harvey Brickster was in a holding cell without bail, and his empire was being dismantled piece by piece by the agents I used to work with. But as I watched my granddaughter, I knew my work was not done. The shadows of the past had been chased away, but the future was a long, winding road. I had dusted off the warrior I used to be, and I decided I would not be putting her back in the box anytime soon. I would be here, watching, ready to do whatever it took to ensure that this little girl grew up without fear. I was Martha Ellington, and I was just getting started. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below to say hi and share your thoughts on the ending. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help this video reach even more people.